Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation called Europe's Moment, Advancing Clinical Research and Health Innovation in the EU. So, first of all, welcome to a lovely bright day in Brussels. We are today going to be talking particularly about the importance of clinical research in Europe. Now, Europe has a proud history of strength in life sciences and the bio-industries. It's an area we can rightly be proud of. If you look at Europe's history, it's an area we've had leadership and an opportunity to take a global space. I could just mention areas of medical knowledge, medical devices, and particularly vaccines, areas where Europe has traditionally had some strength. But are we resting on our laurels? Can we still say that today in 2025 we have the same position, the same strengths and the same capacities going forward? And we know how important that will be to our industries, to our societies and to our economies. You all know that a healthy population is absolutely critical to a functioning economy. So do we have the infrastructure, the ecosystem that we need in Europe for the future? That's a question I'm going to be discussing with my panelists and speakers, and you will also have an opportunity to join in. Those of you who are watching us online, you'll be able to submit your questions via Slido, and I will be keeping an eye on that. For those of you who are here with us, and I'm delighted to see so many faces here, it'll be hands up when I open the floor and a microphone will come to you. So let me invite my speakers to come and join me here, and we will be getting straight into our debate. So please, come and join me. Thank you. So just think for a moment. In your own life, how has medical innovation, medical research made a difference to you and your family? When you think, for example, the prevalence of chronic disease in Europe and the fact that we are an aging population, in fact, Europe is the fastest growing, oldest continent in the world. So this is an area where we're going to need to rely on our strengths, rely on our capacity to deliver the medical innovation we need to keep people healthy, independent, active in the workplace and in our societies. So this is an area we really need looking forward. And that's not even to mention things like climate change that will bring new threats and new areas that we can't predict yet, where we will also need the capacity to innovate. We've just been through a global pandemic where we needed international collaboration and a vaccine which saved millions of lives around the world and allowed us to reopen our societies and move forward. And that was all thanks to medical innovation that was actually built on more than a decade of clinical research that was then able to be transformed quickly into a vaccine we could all use. So we have in recent history and recent knowledge got this experience of how important it is to be able to build on research and innovation that exists. So let me start with my first question. I'd like to introduce Richard Robinson, who is the Executive Director and Head of European Policy and Government Affairs for Bristol-Myers Squibb. Let me start by asking you a very simple question. How can Europe stay competitive as a place for clinical research, and why is that important?
Well, thank you very much for the fantastic introduction and for the invitation to be here and part of this esteemed panel today. Bristol-Myers Squibb runs approximately 120 clinical trials across Europe today involving 17,000 patients. So let me start with that sort of underlying question of why is this important? So clinical trials are crucial. They're the cornerstone of medical innovation. They provide the data which allows us to demonstrate the efficacy and the safety of the next generation of medical breakthroughs. They're incredibly important for patients because they provide access to therapies that may be life-changing for those individuals. They may be the only option for treatment that those patients have. And importantly for Europe's economy, they're also incredibly high value. So clinical trials provide over 1.5 billion euros of inward investment into Europe every year. Tamsin, you rightly said that Europe has a proud legacy in this space. That's absolutely true. It's a natural home for conducting high-quality clinical trials with scientific excellence and universal health coverage in member states. But, and I'm afraid there is a but, despite those strengths, Europe is losing ground. It is not currently competitive in the clinical research space. And just one piece of data to demonstrate that, Europe's share of global clinical trials has halved over the last decade, from 18% to only 9% of global clinical research. So the Draghi report rightly highlights this competitiveness gap, and I think we're all here today because we see it too, and we need action. A couple of thoughts on how we deal with the gap and how do we address it. We think this is about Europe acting as a truly harmonized market for clinical research. Too often we see divergence and barriers between systems and between member states. What we need to move to is the ability to conduct multi-country trials in a streamlined way, which allows for rapid patient recruitment. One way to do this is to address the significant differences which exist between member states in ethics committees, for example, or in contracting. One simple, quick win might be to introduce standard contractual clauses which could be replicated across Europe. And finally, cross-border patient access. We believe that patients should be able to access clinical trials wherever they live in Europe. This would not only improve recruitment, but it would also address equity in access to innovation. Now, the clinical trials regulation was designed to address many of these issues, but I think the implementation has been uneven, and that means that in many ways it has only added to the complexity. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Becca about I know the Commission's prioritisation of this area. Great to see it highlighted in the Life Sciences Strategy, and I think there's a huge opportunity for us to work together to improve Europe's competitiveness in the space.
Thank you. Now you've highlighted that there's a lot of room for improvement, particularly around the way that clinical trials are developed and the process, the sort of admin, the regulation around that. But of course, that's just part of the aspect of Europe's health ecosystem, and part of what strengthens Europe's position in life sciences is not just that research gets done here, but research gets implemented and used. From your perspective, you're already conducting clinical trials here. How important is it that it fits within this broader sense of you've got health systems ready to go, ready to use it, functioning well?
Yeah, absolutely crucial. You'll be not surprised to hear me say that. Really important that health systems aren't just passive recipients of innovation. They need to be active enablers of that innovation. And therefore, we need a holistic approach. It is not enough to simply focus our attention and our policies on boosting clinical trials. We need a holistic approach that addresses all aspects of that life sciences ecosystem and be really aware of unforeseen consequences. One example on that front would be the measures being proposed within the General Pharmaceutical Legislation to limit the intellectual property attached to medicines. Our concern is that would send a very damaging message to investors that the EU does not recognise and reward innovation and could then have a knock-on effect on clinical trial investment. I will also say that there is a vital part of this which is about the assets, the medicines being assessed in clinical trials, then being available to patients in a commercial setting. Too often that is not the case. Many innovative products are not available to patients in Europe because of reimbursement hurdles and outdated HDA assessments. Payers often view those medicines as a cost to the system to be managed downwards or addressed, and not as an investment in societal benefit. So if Europe is to maintain and increase its competitiveness in this space, we really need to look across the system, including in member states, about how they can boost their health systems and boost their investment in medical innovation.
Thank you. Rainer, can I come to you? Rainer Becker, the Director for Medical Products and Innovation for DG Santé. So we've got this brand new life sciences strategy. Very exciting to see that political priority on it. Can you tell us what's in it in terms of implementation, and particularly around this area of Europe as a competitive place for clinical research to happen and clinical trials to take place?
Thank you. Very gladly try to address that, but maybe to just, you will all have seen in the Life Sciences Strategy, which is really broad and encompassing, what a prominent role clinical research has been given there, and that was a very conscious choice. So it is about competitiveness, and a lot, I totally agree with, I think, everything you said. And maybe just one thing, it is not only the competitiveness, it is critical really for public health to bring the medical innovation to Europe. And if you have a clinical trial happening here, you could say, well, what do we care? Let's rely on clinical trials elsewhere. No, it matters here. A clinical trial anchors the medicine in Europe. So it is important for early access to treatments, but also then to an earlier launch and to really have the medicine here in Europe. So there's definitely, next to competitiveness, there's also the public health angle to it. And you didn't, of course, deny that. But I want to just give this extra, because we do emphasize both things in the life sciences strategy, but it is also about competitiveness. And that is, I wouldn't call it ironic, but it is important to recall when the original clinical trials regulation was designed, enacted, one of the main objectives was precisely already back then, long before Draghi, it was already competitiveness. And that is important. We have a single entry point, CETIS, you have for multinational, you have the coordinated assessment. But precisely when it comes to multinational, we see that despite those rules, we have been losing ground, and that those multinational clinical trials do in practice, well, not only in practice, they are perceived to be, and I think objectively perceived to be, burdensome, complex, and timely. I was going to say, they in reality, well, not already in the law, I think for a multinational clinical trial, I think we are at 105 days. In reality, it can be significantly more if there are RFIs. And if you compare that to our competitors around the globe, those regions with whom, and I'm sure, Richard, when you're pitching, let's do the clinical trials in Europe within your company, you may have your nice colleagues from other parts of the world that make an equal pitch. And they can be pitching, we offer 60 days. And some of them will say, we can actually do 40 days. So time matters. And some may say, it's an unfair comparison. You're comparing apples with pears. This is a one language, one country clinical trial. And in Europe, we have 27. Fine, you don't have to do multinational over 27, but still, it's not fair. Maybe it's not fair. It is comparing apples with pears. We do have in our setting, in this union, certain challenges, but it is the comparison that does exist in real life, and that is, I think, why it's critical to do something and to address, and that's why the Commission has committed in the life sciences strategy, really, and the occasion will be, one occasion will be the upcoming Biotech Act, which will be, or at least contain, a regulation, and a regulation is an occasion also to think, and one angle of the Biotech Act will be really addressing, trying to make a step forward on regulatory simplification, where we can do something to facilitate, but also accelerate time to market. So that will be one occasion. I think we will be looking in the context of the Biotech Act, and are ready to look what is needed, what can be done in the space of clinical trials, in the clinical trials regulation, to see. Next to that, and because I know there's a lot of talk about the Biotech Act life, we should not forget implementing. The CTR has many, many good things. And some of those treasures have not yet been harvested. I know not everybody agrees associating the CTR with treasures, but I do say it consciously. It has brought a lot of improvement. Think where we have been coming from with the directive. So I think the clinical trials regulation, major step forward. I think also really going forward and trying to implement and harvest some of those potentials much better by implementing, by really have the role of the RMS coordinating and avoiding duplication. So I think that is something that can already be done today with the current rules.
Thank you. Let's just unpack some of the alphabet soup for the audience. You mentioned the RMS and the CTR. Of course, the CTR is the clinical trials regulation. Tell us about the RMS, and you mentioned the Biotech Act, which is forthcoming. But what we really want to understand is what potential sort of regulatory or legal changes might be coming up that would help address the issues that you mentioned. Things take too long, they're a bit complex, they're burdensome, and yet there's treasures, as you said, that we haven't yet managed to reveal.
Yes, and I think it will also be an occasion maybe to put further treasures into the CTR, which is the clinical trials regulation. The simple answer, I think, would be we really will try to make it simpler, faster, and more predictable. The legal framework, the regulatory framework for clinical trials. So if we're looking at the CTR, I think that will be the overall theme. And the RMS, which is the member states coordinating clinical trials, I think we can take a step already under the current rules. A lot more can be done to really fulfill the concepts of the coordination under the CTR with life. But we can think further and take it a step further and maybe have even more reliance. Think of the pharmaceutical space out there, where you also have cooperation across member states, and where the reliance on one member state's assessment is greater than currently foreseen under the CTR. So that would be just one idea. I don't want to go too much into speculation or saying, listen, Article 25.a, I have no idea what it is in there, just made that one up. But no, the point is we have launched a consultation. We are here, and one of the reasons, thanks for putting really the spotlight on clinical trials, the Friends of Europe spotlight. For us, it was a great occasion to hear, to listen, and to pick up signals from the market, from those who do this in daily practice. And we have launched a public consultation, I think, well, several probably, but one is still going on, a call for evidence until the 10th of November. So please make sure you have your say. And I'm very happy to discuss also ideas coming from the audience, coming through Slido, I think. So very happy to go there. The objective will really, what we have been hearing is timing is crucial. It may sound like a few days only, but timing, speeding up is very important. I think reinforced coordination, what I was just hinting at with the RMS, it could be taken to another level, but also streamlining ethic reviews. That is what we have been hearing so far as a strong voice. Let me know if that would match your assessment. More risk-based approaches when you think of low intervention clinical trials. So plenty of ideas, and I'm sure that many of you have been discussing, so please do share your thoughts with us. We are here to listen and then hopefully to make the best out of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Rainer. Now it's the moment I'd like to open the floor to you. If you're in the room and you'd like to put your hand up, now's the opportunity. And for the audience online, I'm keeping an eye on the Slido, so I'll be able to bring these elements in. So we've just touched on the fact that Europe has strong historic legacy of strength in life sciences, but this is an area that is eroding its competitive position globally. That's partly because of the nature of Europe, with 27 countries, lots of languages, fragmented systems, but that this has been recognized for some time, and that already the clinical trials regulation attempted to make it easier, but even with that, we recognize it's still costly, it's still a bit slow, it's heavy and burdensome, but there are some elements, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, looking to see how to improve it, but there is still areas where we need to deliver better change for that, particularly because Europe needs to maintain its position as a place to do research and for that clinical research then to be used and implemented. Let me see if there's anyone here in the audience who would like to ask a question. Yes, if you could put your hand up so the microphone can come to you, and if you'd just like to briefly let us know who you are, and we'll take your question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a very nice panel. My name is Jakub, and basically I have one question. Whenever we are always talking about legacy of Europe, this is basically in every single discussion in Brussels. We're talking about legacy of Europe, Europe having legacy in this, that, but the legacy of Europe is actually what is dragging it down. We are not addressing the fact that, okay, we have 27 different national legislation. We have the European legislation on top of that. The reason why US is, for example, a powerhouse for research and innovation is because they have a single civil code, or basically the rules that are established for research or so on are just basically single for with federal level, and then states have some variety. So why nobody is actually addressing this issue? Because say we can talk about, for example, clinical trial regulation from the European Council or from European Union, but still we are addressing just single silos, and we're not addressing the underlying problem.
Jacob, where are you from?
Poland.
Yes, but which organization?
Oh, basically I'm working for my own company over here. I'm representing a client from Czech Republic.
Okay, great. So you're coming from the East, so you've seen some of the fragmentation and some of the issues that we've talked about. And your question is, why do we not go for a sort of bigger picture issue? And then it's Europe's fragmentation. The fact that, I mean, bear in mind that legally, under the treaty, health is a national issue, and it's written very clearly in that. So I'm not quite sure if you're asking if we're going to reopen the treaty or whether we could do better by using the tools that we already have.
My idea is that we need to think bigger, we need to think better, and basically if opening a treaty is an issue that we have to deal with, because also we talk about, say, like a single market. Single market is also actually a patchwork of national markets. So basically if a treaty is a problem, then let's remove the treaty and let's think about the innovation, because we should remove the status quo.
So I think the point you're making, which is a relevant point, is that, you know, Europe's strength is also past strength is also an area that perhaps is holding it back, because we need to completely reinvent the way we approach this. So you're inviting us to think about a big paradigm shift. So let me put that to the panel. Rainer, we also have a couple of questions online that somebody very sharp-eared noticed that when you mentioned the Biotech Act, you mentioned it will contain a regulation. And somebody said, oh, is that a new, like the pharma package? Will it have new laws in it, or et cetera? So that's a very specific question. And let me ask Richard, we were invited to think very big. How much can be done within sort of the existing framework, and how much are you clapping and say, absolutely, let's get Europe to think about health as a sort of strategic cross-policy area rather than leaving it fragmented? Are you a cheerleader for that, or are you saying more can be done? So let me start with you, Ryan. Just a question of clarity. Did you mean to say the Biotech Act is a package with lots of little laws inside, or is that just a mischaracterization?
No, don't read too much into what I was saying. I think most acts, Raw Materials Act, Critical Medicines Act, they were technically in legal terms a regulation. The only reason why I translated the jargon acts into regulation is to illustrate that one regulation can easily amend another regulation, meaning the Biotech Act will be an occasion actually to make legal changes in existing secondary legislation.
Thank you.
As simple as that.
Richard, how bold do you want us to be about this? And I speak as someone, I've worked in public health at European level since 2002, and one of my first pieces of work was lobbying the then Convention on the Future of Europe to try and reopen the treaty specifically to get health as a broader issue. I'm sad to say we failed then. It was bargained away to have an aim of full employment. It was quite specifically bargained away in 2002. So I'm all for this call for more Europe.
Yeah, Jacob, thank you very much for the question. I think I'll maybe refrain from delving into European politics and treaty reopening too far, but I will just reiterate what I said in relation to clinical trials, which is that Europe's potential lies in a far more harmonized and joined up approach, and that the same applies to many other areas of healthcare, of course. You mentioned the United States. In fact, China is also the other huge, highly competitive market in this space, which has attracted a huge amount of clinical trial activity over the last decade at Europe's expense. And the same would be true of that country as well.
Thank you. Yes, please, Rainer.
Now, maybe directly on the treaty. I know it's a dangerous question for a commission official, but so whether or not to open the treaty, to do something, it will not be the question of clinical trials that will drive that. And I think if, in the bigger picture, it does become opened for whatever reason, one day, I don't know, I think then absolutely one should be looking at health and what could be done. But in the meanwhile, and that's thanks a lot, you already put that, even with the current situation, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of coordination to have more Europe and more of a single voice. So I would be much more optimistic than what was, I think, underlying your question. A lot more can be done under the current treaty and the competences. I think there's a lot of potential. And I do agree. Let's think big. Don't think in silos. If there is a willingness to reform, make use, put bold ideas on the table, and then let's see what we can make out of it.
Thank you. I think this is a really good moment for me to bring in our next speaker, and that's Nathalie Seigneuret, Senior Scientific Officer for the Innovative Health Initiative Joint Undertaking, which again is quite a mouthful, but largely it's important to know that your focus is on improving public-private partnerships to deliver some of this collaboration that we've just been speaking about. And we heard from our panel members and also from the audience, look, reinforced coordination. We have governments committed to both universal health systems and to making Europe a place for life sciences. So the public commitment is there. How important is public-private collaboration to strengthening Europe's role in life sciences?
Yes, so thank you very much for this question. I think it's important to remember that we want to have an ecosystem that is strong for both commercial as well as non-commercial sectors. So obviously, if you want that, it's important to have the collaboration between all the actors so that all the perspectives are taken into account when trying to find solutions to make it stronger. So the public-private partnership is a mechanism by which you can really bring all the sectors to work together, from the public, from the private, in order to address the competitiveness, the attractiveness of Europe in terms of clinical trial. And that has been recognized in the reports that were mentioned, the Draghi report, the Leta report, about the vehicle, the mechanism of public-private partnership. So IHI, the Innovative Health Initiative, for instance, we are working to bring under a neutral space all the different actors from the industry sectors, but as well the hospital, the academic centers, the research organization, the patient organization, the regulators, to all work together towards a common goal and co-creating the solution, but making sure as well that we can pilot them, because this is important. We need to find solutions that can be implemented into the healthcare system as well as into the industrial in a way processes. So we need to ensure that through this project that we are funding, we can pilot already this solution so that it will show that indeed we can go this way or not that way or whatever, but that we co-create this solution. An important aspect as well about public-private partnership is that obviously we break the silos, we get all the perspective, but we can do things at scale because we can leverage the expertise, the experience, but as well the resources from both the public, but as well the contribution. And that is really important to highlight that in HI, the contribution from companies are in kind. So it's not just cash. So we all work together in order to ensure that, again, we can enable this translation of the research into a solution that can be implemented, deployed, and used. And if we want to have, of course, in HI, we cannot do project to change the legislation. We can test things that could eventually help with implementing some aspect of the legislation. But we can go even broader. We know as well that if you want to have a strong ecosystem, you need to have trained sites. You need to have access to all these sites with processes in place that the contract can be really rapid. But you need to have as well the capacity of doing these innovative trials, but we need to implement this innovation in terms of protocols and all that, so the sites needs to be ready. We need to have the right endpoint. We need to have the right outcome, etc. So there's many research as well that can be done through PPP that will certainly help to show that Europe remains a strong place for research.
Thank you. Again, because many people may not know your organization and a little bit of what it does, I'd love to hear if you can give me any concrete examples of where you've got projects that might address some of these challenges. We talked about the fact it's complex, it's time-consuming, it's heavy administration. You need the capacity to recruit patients from across Europe. You need to be able to follow the data and to do the follow-up and get an agreed endpoint. Can you give us a couple of concrete examples, anything you could highlight for say, this is how we're making a difference. This is how an SME is able to start to work at capacity in a way that was not possible.
So I will give you just a couple of examples, because of course we do have a large portfolio of projects that have already delivered tools that allow to make the clinical trials more efficient from an operational point of view, as well as from a design point of view, and making as well the trial more patient-centric. So just one example that I will start with. Pediatric clinical trial in children. We had before a couple of networks already existing in Europe. However, the companies were saying, well, you know, with the pediatric regulation, we don't have the capacity to do the clinical trials in Europe. Hence, we launched the project C4C, Connect for Children. This project has established some processes that allow any sponsor to go from directly to a single contact point. The network is more than 250 hospitals and clinical sites in Europe, in 21 countries, with 20 national hubs. So by going to this single point, you can reach out the whole network, and very rapidly they can identify the sites who can do the study in less than 2 weeks. They can check the feasibility in 6 weeks. And then, so you diminish the risk of having site open, not recruiting, and you accelerate your start of the trial. This is a concrete example, and the project has ended. Now it's an organization, and the organization is active. So thanks to our project that has been big investment from everybody to really make sure that we have a network fully built that can carry out all these clinical trials, and on the top of it, having expertise around working with the network in order to give advice. It won't replace the regulatory advice, but already give the advice to the sponsor on how to make efficient the trial. So that's a concrete example. Another example I would give, we talk a lot about platform trial. That is really important to implement in Europe. Our project EU Pearl did a lot of work on toolbox on how we can implement and not reinvented the wheel all the time. As soon as you move from one area to another area, how do you make, you can reuse what has been done in somewhere else. So they have developed this toolbox, and on the top they were trying to work on several areas. One of those was depression. They work on the master protocol, and now this master protocol is being deployed in clinical in 6 centers, and now we can do this platform trial across 6 countries. So this is a concrete example again on how we can move and shift things that when we work together and when we make sure that we can implement them. Another example, if I have time, decentralized trial. We all talk about that this is something that we need as well to focus on in order to use the digital technology, but as well to reduce the burden for the patient to go to the clinical sites. But while we all talk about that, there's still a little bit of uncertainties on how, when, how best to make them, their acceptability, what's really the benefits. So we do have a project that has been working a lot on this aspect called Trials at Home. The project threw as well a proof of concept trial that they did. Now they have developed some recommendations that can be used for any sponsor and for anyone in the field of clinical trial. And actually they are going to maybe present their results at the end of October. So stay tuned, because I think that will be very important recommendation that will come out from actually a proof of concept trial to see what works, what doesn't work, so how best to do this trial in Europe. And I have other examples, but I will stop here.
Excellent, thank you. Well, those are 3 very concrete examples to help us understand how you're putting in place some of the tools that would, make it easier for people to navigate the complexity and the fragmentation of the European market. Pediatrics, as you said, is a very specific challenge. Patients are children, so you've got family issues to deal with. They're a much smaller proportion of the population, so it's harder to recruit. So that's very interesting. Perhaps before you pass the microphone, so just come back. You mentioned decentralized trials and platform trials. Just help everyone understand what they are. I'm waging war on terminology here, and so just let's really get to that. What is a platform trial?
So platform trial, it's a way of not having necessarily just one arm, and with your control arm, you can have many arms with one control arm, and you can have a system to bring the compound. You see straight away if maybe it will work, not work, and then if it doesn't, you can remove this arm, you can add another arm. So that's a more efficient way of doing trials.
Okay.
That has been there. It's there, and regulators keep saying that we can use it. But again, it's when, how, and you need to have the infrastructure to use it.
Okay, so it's more flexible in your ability to test out new tools, protocols, treatments, when you've got a clear sort of endpoint in goal, and you have more ability to say, well, that's working, not working, let's try something different.
Yes, especially as well because you have this master protocol. Okay. So basically, you have the same protocol for testing all these different compounds.
So it reduces the number sort of administrative hurdles you have to go through, etc.
Yes.
Great, that's really helpful for us to understand all of that language. In a moment, I'm going to be opening the floor to you, so please feel free, have your questions or comments ready. Nina, I'm going to bring you in now. Nina Arwal, you're a partner and co-head of Trill Impact Ventures, and on this particular panel, you represent the money, because you make decisions about investments. Not literally, I won't ask you to open your wallet, but when we're talking about competitiveness and Europe's position globally, this is a question. We heard from Richard that, it's a question of pitching Europe versus other parts of the world to say, this is the place that we want you to do your trials, to do the research, etc. When decisions are made about how to invest and where to invest, we've heard some examples from the members of the panel, what they're doing concretely to try and improve it. From your perspective, as an investor, what's still missing? What are the gaps we need to fill to sort of turn maybe to a yes, absolutely, Europe's the place to do this?
Thank you. And like you say, I mean, this is a broad topic. I'm going to be representing, the investor in early stage innovation. So, I mean, you can be different kinds of investors, but that's the perspective I'll bring. I'd love to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to come to your question, but I want to zoom out because I think the briefing you had for this event today summarized it well, of saying that, the state of affairs in clinical trials is very much a reflection of the state of affairs in life science innovation, right? Like you speak to the pilgrimage to China in the past 10 years, it's of course because that commercial market is booming, right? So clinical trials in Europe is a reflection of the fact that the commercial state of affairs in European life science innovation is not what it should be. So I want to quote the late professor of Harvard Business School, Clayton Christensen, who said that in business strategy, the new game begins before the old game is over. And so I would argue that the old game, which is to be a European life science company, let's take it a small biotech that I would invest in, and that is more or less betting the farm on getting approval in the American market and catering to American patients. That was never a fully sustainable model. It brought with it that they didn't focus as much as they should have maybe on European patient needs and not really catering to European payers. And we've heard the conversation in the US over the past decades of addressing pricing, and let's see if it happens now or not. But I mean, the writing is on the wall that maybe that model was never fully sustainable. But I think with the current policy shift that we've seen over the past years on everything from science funding to change of the FDA to pricing conversations and tariffs, I think everyone agrees that whether that old game is totally stone dead or just, in the CPR mode, I think we need to look at a new game. And so what is that new game? If I knew that, I would not spend my day on the train to Brussels. But I have some ideas, and I want to talk about how I think the new game needs to center for now we're talking about European life science industry, it needs to center around the European market, right? Like that is somehow the cornerstone, European patient needs, and what, quite frankly, European payers are willing to pay for. I think that's the cornerstone. We can leverage our own market. I think your point of is it a market or is it 27? I'll get back to that a little bit, but in total, it is a big market, right? We could leverage that if we were selling something that people around here would want to pay for and could pay for. But it, of course, also has that benefit that if you do think about cost effectiveness as some kind of relative term of affordability, it unlocks multiple other geographies in middle-income countries that are absolutely not, open to life science innovation today. If you take the $2 million gene therapy as an extreme, if you will, which is, where the future is going on life science innovation. So there's something about cost effectiveness. There's something about thinking about Europe and the needs of Europe. And so, the skeptic will say, yes, but that model is not sustainable because, of course, the US brings a large part of the commercial business case. And so if you think about cost effectiveness, how does this equation balance? Well, then I will say, then I think we as a ecosystem, meaning both industrial players, but also governments and policymakers, need to come to the table and think about what we can do on the cost side of the equation. And so I'll bring up three things. The first one, I would say, is the most novel and exciting one, which is the emergence of AI in clinical development. I mean, we saw last year the first Nobel Prize for the application of AI in the early R, meaning AlphaFold, the early R of R&D, and that is, such a huge discovery and application. But that is just the beginning, right? Like if you think about what AI can do as you progress through clinical development, where the bulk of cost sits, I think we should all, there's reason to get very excited. And I'm sure that you and your colleagues spend a lot of time thinking about how can we think about stratification of patients in clinical trials? How can we think about patterns that show us efficacy signals? To your point of how do we think about how we design trials, reduce the number of patients in trials, think about the safety aspect of how can we, maybe go to a system where we get onto the market and identify safety signals in a different way that pushes the burden of the regulatory or the safety demonstration once you're also in the market and so on. So I think, this is a whole new era we're entering, and I think we should be very excited about that. The second one is that of harmonization. Hello, please. I think we all know that the harmonization piece has to happen. So you guys are in Brussels every day. You hear it more often than I do, but I think it would be impossible to have a conversation about time and cost of market that didn't include a really, really, competitive conversation around harmonization across jurisdictions. Then the third one is on that of regulatory. Investing across the various aspects of life science and everything from rare disease to, the big diseases, it is, of course, very clear to see that the definition of the let's call it cost-benefit equation on regulatory burden is not a black and white, right? Like the regulatory burden in a rare disease trial is very different from, of course, if you're doing it in a cardiovascular trial, and that's all fair and well. But I think in this new era, if we're asking industry to come to Europe and say, let's think about how we do this, let's talk about pricing, because you will not get American prices in Europe. I think that everyone knows that. I think we also need to have a conversation of saying, how can we be much smarter and not pragmatic, how can we be smarter on how we think about regulatory programs to make sure no one's looking to not have a seatbelt in the car. But what does that seatbelt in a modern car look like? Again, using AI and other things, because I think if you look at the evolution of the regulatory burden from the, let's say, 1950s, which, by the way, some of the bulk of neuropsychiatric drugs that we use today were approved in an era where the regulatory burden was very different compared to today. I think, this is not a black and white. I'm not here to go rogue, but I'm saying I think the conversation around what regulatory burden can look like and how, conditional approvals and other things like that can help companies get to market at faster time, lower cost, has to also to be a part of the equation. So what I'm asking is not a full-blown, let's change the treaty, but I am asking for things that I realize are not fully easy. It will require collaboration across all the stakeholders here and others, meaning, governments, policymakers, industry, investors, all of it. Everyone has to come to the table. The opportunity, I would argue, to your point of the title of Europe's moment, I think this can be Europe's moment of saying, let's innovate for Europe, but by the way, it will also be innovating for the majority of the world. So we're saving a lot of lives, but we're also unlocking business that wasn't available. And I think the alternative is to sit tight and watch the steady decline. And we could be here in a panel in 3 years and talk about how the 9% is 6%.
Thank you for that. I mean, you've given us lots to talk about, not least, I think, the fact that we can continue business as usual and then see things, that trend of decline continue, or we can be different. And when we spoke just before this started, you used the word intentional, that Europe could be intentional about its approach. And you challenge us to say, look, Europe, very rightly, because it's the sort of universal health systems and often a single payer, has a very sharp eye on costs. But that really is also a similar point for large parts of the world, lower and middle income countries, that also would have a very high priority on cost effectiveness. So how can we turn that into an advantage? Now, already, for example, in the medical devices regulation, there are more than 100 countries around the world that use European regulation as a template for what they do. And what you're saying is, if we are more intentional about our approach to what are Europe's medical needs, public health needs, how does that then become an attractive place to research and find medical innovation with an appropriate funding mechanism? This could unlock opportunities for other parts of the world. And you again encourage us to acknowledge that the old business models no longer make sense, not least because the business models were dependent on being able to go to America and gain a lot of money from high prices. That's very clearly over. And as you know, American approach to science is rapidly changing. Europe is stepping forward and say, hey, we are the place for independent science, for quality science, for evidence-based, but we need to back that up. You challenge us in a number of different ways. So I'm going to invite all the panel perhaps to respond to some of the things that Nina said. She asked us to be intentional. Europe's moment is right here. And she challenged us to look beyond sort of the approach of budgeting as a narrowing framework, but opened it up to say this is an opportunity, but harmonization needs to happen. So I'm going to see if anyone here in the audience would like to add a comment or a question, and members of the panel, who else might like to pick up the challenge that Nina has put on the table for us. Do I have anyone who would like to make a comment here? Okay, I've got two here. If you could just bring the microphones.
Thank you very much. So my name is Teresa Echevarria, and I work for the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority from the European Commission. I'm a seconded national expert. So, well, it's going to be an open question for any of you, but it's based on my thoughts of our clinical research landscape in Europe. I think it's very robust, and I think it's very safe. And maybe I sound a little bit too naive and optimistic, but I like to think, as a European citizen, I feel proud of this system, which guarantees the safety of patients and is patient-centered, or so I tend to think based on my experience. But sometimes this does not correlate with reducing timelines and competitiveness. So my question is, are we willing to sacrifice this robustness in Europe in areas of more competitiveness? That would be basically the question. During COVID-19, we managed to reduce timelines. It was an emergency situation and with some gaps and space for improvement, but we did manage to launch relevant clinical trials across Europe, and I include the United Kingdom here. So maybe we should look up into these lessons learned and focus on our strengths and improve those gaps.
Thank you.
That's my question.
Let me hear your intervention as well. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I'm Lydie Meeheus from the Anti-Cancer Fund. We are a non-profit research foundation, and I would like to bring to the table a solution maybe, that if you have centralized market authorization, like for cancer, ATMPs, all those indications, why should we not have centralized approval of clinical trials also by EMA? And why don't we have compulsory scientific advice? Because what we learn from companies, and what I've seen also being working with it within EMA, is that US companies are very surprised that when they deliver their results and a product is safe and you have efficacy, that's within the limits of EMA, then they have to start dealing with the HTA, which has asked for different endpoints, different data. And so I think it would save a lot of time and energy for everybody if we have compulsory scientific advice with input from HTA, and that work is in progress, I know, but we're not there yet, so that at least the clinical trials that are run in Europe will deal both with the questions from EMA and from HTA.
Okay, thank you. So panel, we've got two inputs there. We've got the first one to invite you to just reflect on, is there a trade-off between the robustness of our system now, where patient safety is at the heart, and our chasing of competitiveness to, you know, is it a race? Are those two contradictory? And then we've got a very clear question to say, look, we have mechanisms in cancer and advanced medicinal therapies. Why don't we allow the EMA to do centralized approval for trials and others? In other words, how can we use something that we've approved and works in one area to make that more general? So members of the panel, you're welcome to come in on any of that and any final message. Rainer, you've picked up the microphone, so you're ready to run with this. Please, go ahead.
Just to pass it to the left. No, no, actually, I do have the urge to say something, but I do agree, whether it's yours moment, but I think there is a moment here. And I hope there's also a momentum for Europe. We have a lot to put on the table. The scientific excellence is still there. The clinical research infrastructure is fantastic. I mean, we have a lot to offer. If you compare to other parts of the world, when it comes to policy making, I think we may also have some greater stability and also commitment to scientific research to offer. And on top of that, and that's I'm glad that you made that point, we also have a fourth thing to offer, which is the readiness to look at our regulatory system and to run a very good check for competitiveness, but it is compatible. Of course, you can have patient safety and a more competitive and a possibly less costly and less timely regulatory system. I'm speaking abstract here. We can directly go into clinical trials, but you mentioned medical devices. Of course, there are things you can do in the clinic, in the medical device, in the IVDR rules that lead to more proportionate, I'm carefully choosing my words, so it's not just cutting, it's a completely free for all. I think you're referring to the 50s. I'm not sure whether I really want to go back to an era where...
I didn't, for the record. I absolutely said I didn't. But I'm saying people use those medicines...
Microphone so that the audience can hear.
That is true. Anyway, no, I didn't want to suggest that you're dreaming to go back to regulatory levels of the 50s. Apologize, but let me just make my argument. I think it is absolutely compatible that we have a really robust patient safety system, which has rules that are more proportionate, which are less complex, and that leads to more reliable drugs. So with the pharma regulation, the overall pharma package, the review, scientific advice will become much more available. HTA is in progress. So I think what I really want to say, what we have to offer here is the willingness and the commitment to look also at the regulatory framework and to make it as conducive as possible to a competitive sector here without compromising patient safety. And a lot can be achieved there. So we don't have to freeze as everything. That's not the only guarantee to patient safety.
Thank you. Richard, please go ahead.
Yeah, I will agree, absolutely. I don't think that we need to sacrifice patient safety. I think this is about a pragmatic, risk-based approach that focuses on streamlining and efficiency. And you mentioned the UK. I think we can learn from the UK's experience during COVID and the way in which COVID-based research was rapidly scaled up very effectively and safely. We can also learn from Spain. I talked earlier about the decline in clinical trials across Europe. Spain has bucked that trend and has increased its share of clinical trials by 75% over the last decade. They've done an awful lot very well, and we can learn from them too.
Thank you. And Natalie, you nodded a little bit there. Can I bring you in? You sit right at the juncture between the public and the private, and we've heard that there is sometimes this tension between an attempt to be more competitive, in other words, a race to the bottom against other parts of the world, perhaps with perceived weaker ethical approach and Europe. Do you see that tension? And I'll come to you, Nina. In the work that you see, have we got that balance right? Or is this an area where you're getting messages from either side, either the public or the private, that there is a tension between our robustness and patient safety and an approach to be more competitive?
So first of all, we fund pre-competitive research, and we tend to work more on the tools and methodologies or infrastructure that can help and that can benefit everybody. So in a sense, this tension, we don't really see it because everybody will have the same goal on really what matters in a way. So far, maybe we have been lucky, but we've never seen really a project that we have been funding that there was really big disagreement. Because again, we all work towards the common goal on objective and trying to co-create this solution that can be implemented. So we don't really have this tension because we are under this neutral platform. And the same to the point that you pick up, of course, I cannot comment on making scientific advice mandatory. But when we have been working in some project about looking at endpoints and outcome, for sure there have been the consideration what could be done in a trial that could answer both the regulatory and the HTA. So in order that we can start having the same understanding and really this path, and therefore we can certainly decrease the number of trials that would need to be, or the collection of data that will need to be done afterwards, because it doesn't answer at all the other question. So especially since in our project, and I think this is important to keep this in mind, because we are in this neutral space. We can, and most of our projects have direct or either involvement or direct interaction with the regulators, with the HTA bodies. So then we can already have all this conversation within the project itself.
Thank you. Nina, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I do not want to be remembered as the investors saying that we don't need safety. So I want to give a little nuance. I was speaking to the head of the EMA because I think it's a little bit of an unfortunate black and white type of conversation that doesn't bring us forward. I had a conversation with the head of the EMA last year, I want to say, or 2 years ago, and we were talking exactly about that threshold. Again, that's why I talk about rare disease, because I could counter your argument and say that, you know, the cost of inaction is massive to patients. All the patients that never get access to a drug because the regulatory burden is so tough that you cannot finance the programs, right? Like, so I think it's really about the nuances of saying, in rare disease, the hurdle for how many patients you need to include in a trial is very different from if you're running, let's say, an incremental, I'm sorry, that's a, you know, judgmental word, but like a next generation blood circulation drug, right? Like, it's all about what kind of innovation are we trying to solve for? How big is the unmet need? And what is then the regulatory threshold to bring something to market? I think that's a more helpful way of looking at it than saying that, you know, we shouldn't have any patient safety or we shouldn't have any innovation. Yeah.
Thank you. And before you relinquish the microphone, Nina, let me just invite you to reflect on something, which is you mentioned earlier about the importance of AI, and you told us, look, a lot of the costs in the development of medical innovations happen in the very early stage, in this sort of very, exploratory stage, and how AI could help reduce that burden, which in theory, I suppose, opens things up for SMEs, because one of the areas that Europe is very good at is the innovation coming out of universities. We're less good at taking that sort of research project and turning it to a fully commercialized product. And you're saying that AI has potentially the possibility to reduce all of that, which leaves Europe in a really interesting place. And we heard that this is both Europe's moment and there's momentum, because we've got a renewed commitment to saying, yes, independent, rigorous science, evidence-based is important. It will be used in policy making as a very strong signal. So let me sort of almost leave the last word with you, and hopefully a very positive, optimistic one, to say a little bit more about how you see Europe's approach to digital, the health data space, and it's focused on saying how do we bring the AI and the digital revolution into this area to pick up on some of the perceived difficulties of doing business in Europe. How do you see that balance happening?
I mean, and just to say, I think what I wanted to say was the early R is where AI is being applied now. I think in the years to come, we will see throughout R&D, and of course the bigger costs come at the end. So the biggest cost saving is yet to come, if you will. I think to end on a positive note, I think the diversity of European patients and the quality of the data in Europe is very, very good. I mean, I am not the expert on all the ins and outs of the data space and the sharing and all of that, but I think the optimistic note is to say, and I'll zoom out a little bit from AI only, but it's just to say the quality of the data is really good. The science is very good in Europe, and I think the healthcare systems and the social contract, the expectation from citizens to say, I expect a lot, I think those are fundamentally really competitive components in building a world-class life science ecosystem. So I think we have every chance to be part of this AI race. I mean, maybe not in the big tech, dimension of it, but applying it in life science in a thoughtful way to bring better outcomes to patients. I think Europe should be ahead of that game, and we need to get our act together, all of us, to make sure that that happens.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time together, and I hope you agree it's been a lively and interesting debate, and we've had views from across the different spectrum. But let me draw this to a close by saying that this is both Europe's moment and there is momentum, and we can either take advantage of that and do something about it, or in 3 years meet again and have the same conversation but with worse data and statistics. So the message that we've got coming forward is it's this importance of intention, of clarity of purpose, of saying, Europe will not be America, it will not be China's market, it is its own market, and there are benefits and advantages to that if we get this approach right, open up other markets around the world, which also have a similar approach to cost control and cost management, that we need to be, the sort of public authorities need to be clear in saying, these are our medical needs, these are our populations, these are our public health priorities. Let's dialogue with researchers, with universities. Let's fund that appropriately. Let's dialogue with companies and make sure we're providing the regulatory space, the pre-competitive space, everything we need to do so that our needs get met, and there is an interesting space rather than for innovation to happen on the hopes of generating big bucks over in the US and then we get some of it later, to actually say, no, we are what we are, for better or worse, these are our systems and they have their strengths. Let's start the new dialogue. So I'm going to conclude this panel. Thank you very much for participating, those of you here in the room and those online. Let's take advantage of Europe's moment and keep the momentum going. Thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you at a forthcoming Friends of Europe debate. We've got one coming up very soon looking at climate and energy, so I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.